Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Got a couple of plates that we're spinning today, as always, so welcome. It's great to have you aboard. With our eyes on the White House, President Trump has been speaking for a little while right now in an effort to he's got some business at hand. He's now talking about tariffs and a few other matters, but in fact was signing a couple of resolutions. The White House called them bills, resolutions that target California's EV incentives. They repeal the state-level mandates that have been in place now, supported by the Biden administration. GM, Toyota, among those lobbying against California's rules. If he makes some news here on the story that we're about to tackle, we'll bring you to the White House, because this is a precarious moment ahead of more talks that are scheduled for this weekend. It may not be an accident considering the timing with what we're seeing here, but a stark headline at the top of the New York Times: Israel appears ready to attack Iran. Knowing that this has been in the air for some time, and we've talked about it certainly quite a bit since Benjamin Netanyahu made his most recent visit to the White House, a visit in which President Trump reportedly waved him off. And it might be a little bit different this time with what we're hearing. Israel appears to be preparing to launch the attack soon, according to officials in the U.S. and Europe, obviously at a very sensitive time here in the Middle East. But as I mentioned, American and Iranian negotiators are supposed to get back to the table here on Sunday for another round of talks. And that's where we begin our conversation with Natasha Hall. I'm delighted to say she could join us today at this moment. Non-resident Senior Associate, Geopolitics, Foreign Policy Department at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Natasha, it's great to see you. How much of this do we think is bluster ahead of the next round of talks, or is this a real attack that could be in the offing?
Thank you so much for having me. It's a very tense moment, I have to say. And I think that's really the question, whether or not this is a negotiating tactic. As you mentioned, Witkoff is heading to Oman on Sunday for the sixth round of negotiations with Iranian officials, both direct and indirect. And also tomorrow on Friday, Witkoff will meet with Israeli officials so that Israeli officials can talk about their concerns with regards to the Iranian nuclear program. And one would think it's also about a potential attack. Now, whether or not that attack actually takes place, I think remains to be seen, because I for sure, Trump does not want a never-ending war. The issue is that Netanyahu does. It protects him politically, and surely there are fears in Israel of any kind of Iranian nuclear activity. But the question, again, and I think I mentioned this the last time I was on the program, is on enrichment. Israel does not want Iran to be able to enrich, and Iran sees it as an issue of sovereignty that they can.
Mm-hmm. Well, so we were just looking at images of Steve Witkoff, who is still planning to attend the negotiations. He certainly knows this, Natasha. Is he capable of walking Iran back from that line, or have we in fact found ourselves at a standoff here?
Well, what's interesting is just yesterday, he said that Iran can't enrich uranium. And the U.S. has been back and forth on this, including President Trump. It's unclear if they understand the details of uranium enrichment and a nuclear program for Iran. And I suspect that they're getting a lot of their advice from Israel. Now, the big question is if they are willing to go along with an Israeli attack. Because certainly a coordinated U.S.-Israeli attack on Iranian nuclear facilities would be more profound than Israel going it alone, so to speak. But they would have to at least get the green light. Obviously, Witkoff knows all of this. So potentially we're seeing the evacuation of personnel. We're seeing a lot of this bluster as a means to sort of up the ante prior to these negotiations to really push Iran to the edge. It's still totally well accepted.
Seems like a lot of trouble to be moving all these people to just put on a show. But Natasha, we do have and a really important piece of news here that Steve Witkoff will have with him at the table. This is the hook the administration, I guess, could lean on if, in fact, an attack moved forward here. The IAEA declaring Thursday Iran is not complying with nuclear non-proliferation obligations, the first time the UN's watchdog, has passed a resolution against the country in 20 years. What did you think when you saw that headline?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because, again, you said it's unprecedented. It is unprecedented, and it shows that the U.S. is working with the E3 and with the IAEA on really putting the pressure on Iran to move forward with this. So, I mean, we could be hopeful, but again, last year we saw something like 170 Iranian proxy attacks on U.S. assets in the region. So, very, very scary times. I think we'll see a lot of tensions, especially in some of these other countries like Iraq, where there are softer targets as well. But the IAEA can't do much, but it is another negotiating tactic, I think.
Well, you make an interesting point here about U.S. involvement, because it does seem that Israel would need some help based on some of the reporting that we've done here. You consider the use of bunker busters, air defenses, refueling. How far would the U.S. go in taking part here?
I mean, I think that's the million-dollar question. It's unclear if the U.S. would even be public about coordination with Israel. I think most people would agree that they would be green-lighted, and in order to do the attack, it would be quite brazen for Israel to go it alone. But judging by the statements of Witkoff and of Trump in recent days, it looks like they are very publicly giving the green light, which is, again, why they're evacuating personnel. But I would just say one more thing for your listeners. An attack on an Iranian nuclear facility has happened before. But Iran just goes back to enriching uranium at another level and accelerates potentially. So we could see that again. And, quite frankly, we've been talking about rising tensions in the Middle East quite a bit for 2 years, and it's unclear where this ends. But hopefully it will come to some kind of de-escalation by next week, because I think everyone is on the edge of their seats at this moment in the region.
Israel certainly believes it's in the position of power here, right, Natasha? As we've discussed, there are a couple of reasons why we've found ourselves at this moment, and a lot of it has to do with the lack of air defenses right now that Iran has following the most recent back and forth with Israel. But also an emboldened Benjamin Netanyahu following some of the strife that we've seen in the region here. The idea as well that Iran would respond with hundreds of ballistic missiles, as I read in this story in the New York Times, is being laughed at by Israel, because last time they tried that, most of them were knocked down, Natasha. Does Israel not have the moment that it was looking for?
Iran is in a very vulnerable position, as you point out. There was many different Israeli attacks on Iran and Iranian proxies last year that severely degraded Iran, including Hezbollah, which Iran uses to essentially launch attacks onto Israel and neighboring Lebanon. It doesn't really have that as much anymore, and certainly not Iran and Syria. And so Iran is in a very, very vulnerable position. That said, again, Iran doesn't go to war toe-to-toe with the U.S. or Israel. It sort of negotiates itself in the weeds of these various countries like Iraq. And I would have you know that, the 170 attacks also last year, Iranian attacks, very few casualties of U.S. airmen, of U.S. servicemen. And so, I mean, it's weak attacks, but it does, up the ante considerably. And it makes it much, much harder for the U.S. to have a presence in the Middle East as well.
We're out of time, Natasha. If this happens, would it be after Sunday?
I would suspect this would be after Sunday, yes, for sure. I think, again, whether or not this is for real or not, it's certainly a negotiating tactic.
This next round of talk is going to be critically important. Natasha Hall, I'm so glad that you could join us from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a real voice of expertise that we can bring you here.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
All
or essentially flat, at least on WTI crude today. But both for WTI and Brent yesterday, we saw a very big move to the upside, more than 4% on each, in part after the U.S. decision to pull U.S. diplomats essentially out of Baghdad, as well as issue warnings to family members of military members in the Middle East, all feeding into concern of something that might be coming, as there were reports last night that Israel could be ready to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. And that's something that President Trump today, when speaking and answering questions from reporters at the White House, did not necessarily play down, Joe. He suggested there could be massive conflict coming.
That's right. He said it could well happen, knowing, of course, that talks are still set for Sunday. Steve Witkoff will be in Oman, and there could be some posturing ahead of those talks. But this is a precarious moment. And Michael Allen from Beacon Global Strategies was the first to float the idea here on the program when Benjamin Netanyahu came to town, that is, in fact, what they were talking about. Michael, we know that President Trump waved off that attack at the time. It's become known since then, at least. Is he going to wave off this one?
I think he might try. I think he sees some benefit right now in holding out the prospect that the Israelis might go for it because he wants to strengthen Steve Witkoff's hand as he goes to Oman this weekend. But when you really start to look at some of the factors that are going Israel's way, today, just this morning, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN watchdog group, declared Iran in breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's the first time in 20 years that this has happened. That is significant around the globe. It's not that I think Israel would be toasted if they were to bomb Iran, but it's sort of more understandable in the aftermath of this than it would be otherwise, especially when you consider that the next step might be to refer this to the UN Security Council, which also would trigger additional sanctions from around the world. And if Iran gets out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty altogether, that could almost be an invitation for Israel to go for it.
Okay, so may provide Israel some cover, but at the same time, wouldn't those very same things you're talking about signal that the U.S. has no real hope of getting a nuclear deal with Iran when Iran is doing such things?
I think it's really, really tough because when you think about enrichment, our position is no enrichment in Iran. Their position is, this is one of our red lines and we can't give it up. And we're talking about a consortium. Could we do nuclear fuel rods somewhere else in the Middle East? And Iran, I think, is basically saying, no, it needs to be inside of our own territory. And I think that's why the talks have foundered so far.
So let's say this happens. Does the U.S. provide logistical support, actual hardware? What would be the relationship? Or do we sit back and watch this happen?
So this is the million-dollar question. Have we turned over already the types of munitions that the Israelis would need? Presumably, they would want the Moab, the mother of all bombs, other bunker busters. They would probably want some refueling help from the United States. But what they really need is what we did the last two times there were missiles and drones going between the two countries. They need the U.S. Navy out there with Aegis destroyers knocking down some of these Iranian incoming. And I don't know if President Trump is ready to do these three things. Now, the Israelis may go for it anyway. They're famously creative and think pager operation and a million other things. So they may not need the bunker buster, or they may have an alternative plan. But these are some big question marks.
Well, and as you bring us back to what we've seen in the past when Iran has sent drones and missiles toward Israel, those were largely intercepted, not just with help of the U.S., but with Jordan as well. So when we consider the potential for Iranian retaliation here, is there some major damage that they actually can successfully inflict, considering they weren't successful in past iterations?
They might be able to get, presumably they would throw a lot more ballistic missiles and whatever into Israel, so it may well hit this time. But I think what they're really worried about, the United States in particular, is would the Iranians hit the Gulf allies of Israel and the United States? What would happen in Saudi Arabia? Remember, they hit Abqaiq last time, the big gigantic oil facility. They've also taken, at least the Houthis have taken shots in the UAE before. So I think the Iranians have signaled, you know what, if we get hit, don't think that it's just coming back at Israel. It may come also to your Gulf allies. So that's a big conflagration right there.
What do you make of the move in Iraq? We're trying to get U.S. personnel out of the way already. What is the target in Iraq that would be of value to Iran?
Well, just any place where there are concentrations of Americans in the Middle East that are within sort of
this
the
is more
gun
symbolic
sites.
than
It
anything
is.
else
We
in
have
this
troops
case, right?
there.
Yeah.
We have a bigger American presence, generally speaking, and so I think it's prudent for us to take non-essential personnel and give them the opportunity to leave. But it's it's something that we need to look at. It's a factor. It's a signal for thinking about, well, the United States is starting to take precautionary measures.
Well, and how far in advance do we typically take those? Does that signal that it could be within days what we're talking about here, before Sunday, before Witkoff even gets to Oman to try to deal with things diplomatically?
So I have a feeling that Trump has probably said to the Israelis, let Witkoff go in Sunday, but I think it's very, very soon. You know what? I think the Israelis are also operationally ready. They made a bunch of bombing runs down to hit the Houthi. The way I understand it is they're able to practice some refueling, certainly the distance that it takes to get down there, otherwise get into the nice right formations, have some operational readiness concerns addressed by that operation. So diplomatically, the air defenses being down in Israel, the military in Israel being really ready, you could read into this that something's going to happen soon.
You were Special Assistant for National Security in the George W. Bush administration. Would you be telling the president now that there's still an opportunity for a diplomatic solution or prepare for war?
I would say prepare for war, but that is the moment at which you could have a diplomatic solution when you got really, really close up to the line. So I would never rule it out completely, but I definitely think the United States needs to be thinking through, and apparently we are, what would the third order implications be of this type of strike? It would be big. Now, Israel has got a lot of creative ways to go after all these different sites across Iran, so this could be a really multi-day, maybe even multi-week type of operation.
Well, we'll plan to stay in touch with you as things develop. Michael Allen of Beacon Global Strategies, thank you as always for joining us as we continue to track this story for you here on Bloomberg TV and radio. One of just many stories around the world we have our eye on today. We're also watching, of course, a tragedy unfolding in India after a crash of a Boeing 787 Dreamliner with 242 people aboard an Air India flight. More than 200 bodies have been recovered after that aircraft crashed shortly after takeoff en route to London. And we want to get the latest now from Ryan Bean, Bloomberg U.S. Transport Deputy Team Leader, who's here with us on Balance of Power. Ryan, do we have any indication yet, knowing it's obviously very early into the investigation, of what actually went wrong here, what happened?
Unfortunately, no, we do not. This crash is just still hours old. Recovery efforts are underway. The first phase of a major disaster like this is largely dominated by search and rescue efforts. Investigators from the U.S. And from other countries are planning to travel to India to assist with the local authorities and their national aviation safety investigative team to begin that work. But that's going to still take some time before we really learn what actually happened in this tragedy.
Yeah. Well, we're hearing a lot of speculation, as is often the case, Ryan. The president of the United States, even at a podium a short time ago, suggested some sort of engine failure. And there are eyes on Boeing. There are eyes on GE with the potential for major implications. Boeing's CEO, though, says the company's team stands ready to support the investigation. I wonder to what extent the NTSB will be involved here, knowing that it happened in another country.
They will be involved. Under Annex 13, the home country where an aircraft crash occurs, they take the lead, but they are supported by their counterparts from countries where aircraft are manufactured and where engines are manufactured. So the NTSB, being the sort of preeminent, global authority on these types of investigations, will absolutely have a role, as will Boeing and as will personnel from General GE, who have said that they're both sending personnel to assist, and they stand ready to help the authorities.
Yeah, we just had headlines crossing the Bloomberg terminal that the CEO of Boeing has spoken to the chair of Air India, saying that Boeing's team stands ready to support the investigation. When we consider this Boeing aircraft specifically, Ryan, knowing all of the difficulty that Boeing has had, specifically with the 737 model after several fatal crashes, and of course the blowout of one part of the aircraft last year on that flight in the U.S., Talk to us about the 787. This is obviously a wide-body aircraft. What is its track record? How reliable is this aircraft? Has Boeing had issues with this model in the past?
This aircraft has had heretofore a sterling track record. This is the first fatal accident involving a 787. And this model of aircraft has been on the market for about 15 years. There are over 1,000 in service today. It has, it's a workhorse for global airline fleets connecting international destinations around the world. So this is sort of uncharted territory. Now, the 787 has been under scrutiny for some quality concerns on the part of the FAA in recent years that prompted about a year plus halts to deliveries while Boeing employees reworked elements of the fuselage that the FAA was concerned the work wasn't being properly done on it. But those planes have largely been through that process. Deliveries have resumed, and there has not been a major safety incident involving the plane itself. So this is sort of uncharted territory. And you mentioned Boeing's recent track record and the previous incidents that they've been involved in. This certainly doesn't help what Boeing's trying to do right now, which is get quality under control, resume deliveries, get the cash flow spigot going. We don't know, again, to emphasize, we don't know if there was any issue with this plane whatsoever, or if there are other factors at play here. But it certainly doesn't help the company and CEO Kelly Ortberg in trying to move Boeing beyond the difficult chapter that it's been in for the last several years.
Yeah, the timing is terrible for these companies all the way around. Ryan, thank you so much. Ryan Bean is Bloomberg's U.S. Transport Deputy Team Leader with his eyes on a developing story overseas. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz. We'll keep tabs on this as well as the IPO of Chime. A conversation later with Paige Smith, our finance reporter. Consumer finance looming large today on Wall Street. And we'll have more on that straight ahead on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu for Balance of Power today. And as Charlie checks on Chime for us, of course, doing pretty well on its first day of trading, having already had its IPO priced above the marketed range, opening substantially, about 49% above that price, even if we're trading a little below that level now at $38 a share, as Charlie was just mentioning. But this is just the latest in what have been a series of relatively successful IPOs, thinking back to Circle last week, Joe, and of course, all of it keeping our focus on financial technology in the fintech space.
Really compelling story. The CEO at Chime, Chris Britt, was talking to Ed Ludlow earlier today on Bloomberg TV and radio. Just a fascinating story about how we got here and why there's so much buzz around it. Fee-free banking, payments-driven revenue, and an audience that may not typically be banked, as they say. There's a really interesting trend here with many people who are of lower income, lower means, living paycheck to paycheck, but suddenly have a platform that they can do business on here. And we wanted to talk about it with Paige Smith, Bloomberg's consumer finance reporter, to get a slightly different wrinkle on this story, Paige. A third of the customers are women. What does this tell us about the state of the consumer and its relationship to banking?
I think that's a really good point. This company in particular, which to be clear is not a bank, but offers a heck of a lot of bank-like services to consumers that, like you said, mostly make under $100,000 a year and are turning to this financial technology company as, for things like bread and butter savings accounts and checking accounts and places to put their paycheck. And as you said, it caters to folks that are, maybe would go to a Bank of America, would go to a Wells Fargo, but is actually, they're instead going to Chime.
Well, and to your point about this not being a bank, just a fintech firm that partners with banks in order to offer these services, is there a kind of regulatory risk embedded in this story? Paige, is there a risk that kind of relationship actually gets more difficult for Chime to execute and specifically make money off of?
Well, I would say, to use Chris Britt's words, he has said repeatedly that the company has prioritized playing by the rules. But, again, they are not a bank. They work very closely with banks. They have two bank partners, Stride and Bancorp Bank. And, it's these relationships are common in the fintech space. And yes, regulators have looked at them in the past, but they have not looked at Chime in particular, I believe. And it's certainly something to keep in mind. But I would say that, just to be clear, they are not a bank, but they're a fintech that provides bank-like services and works closely with banks.
And they're giving the big banks a run for their money here. When you start hearing about Chime in the same conversation as Bank of America or J.P. Morgan Chase, what does that tell us about the potential headroom for this company to grow?
They've said they're eyeing a number of different revenue opportunities, but the company is, as they've made very clear, they're a payments revenue-focused company. So they basically make money every time their customers use their Chime branded credit or debit cards. That's how they make money. It's a little bit different than how your standard Bank of America or Wells Fargo makes money. And as they've said, there's more opportunity to sort of take some of those existing customers away from the biggest banks, but also expand on folks who have maybe never had a relationship with a bank of any kind.
All right, Paige, we appreciate it. Bloomberg
Thanks,
consumer
Paige.
finance reporter Paige Smith reporting on Chime's IPO. Again, the debut of trading. It has been trading just under an hour. CHYM is the ticker. We're at $38.75 a share after an IPO, which again priced at the beyond the upper end of the range at $27 a share. So a very healthy debut pop we are seeing for Chime here. And as we keep one eye on the NASDAQ and on Wall Street overall, of course, we're keeping another eye on the happenings here in Washington, including a meeting that will happen at the White House later this afternoon between President Trump and two very important people in the budget reconciliation debate right now, the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, and the Senate Finance Chairman, Mike Crapo, who, of course, Joe, is charged with making any tweaks to the tax policies and Medicaid policies specifically of the House-passed reconciliation.
Yeah, all the fun stuff here that's going to upset everyone in the House is going to probably come out of the Senate Finance Committee. So they do have some things to talk about here, and it's great to be joined by somebody who knows a thing or two about this. Patrick McHenry is back with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, of course, former chair of the House Financial Services Committee, former Speaker Pro Tem. Great to see you.
Great to see you. I'm smiling because, yes, the
you're not part of
consternation, the natural tension between the House and the Senate will be highlighted in the coming weeks.
I bet that's right. We've talked about permanence a lot lately, Kailey and I, and whether that's going to tip the cart over. If you make these cuts permanent, you got to find the money somewhere. If it comes out of salt, we're dead in the water. Is the conventional wisdom right here? Or would you be very hard-pressed to find a Republican who votes for a tax hike?
You're hard-pressed to find a Republican for a tax hike, but we've got narrow majorities here.
Yeah.
You see the tension between the White House and Senator Rand Paul, highlighted that he would otherwise be for a tax cut, but because the debt ceiling is included, he won't play ball. Yeah. That makes it more precarious for the Senate to produce a reasonable tax package. Probably means less tax cuts, in fact, because he's not participating. More spending overall because he's not participating. That's quite frustrating when you're trying to make policy and actually have a more fiscally sound outcome. But I do think you're looking at permanence as a baseline conversation for the Senate. I think that is a net plus. The fact that we have a tax code that's expiring for individuals, and individuals are facing, and small businesses, facing a massive tax increase. Secretary Bessent said it very well before the Congress this week. This could be the largest tax increase in American history. So action is quite necessary for economic growth and economic activity. The debate has gotten become an abstraction from that fact point, which they're trying to draw it back to those really basic principles.
Yeah, and yet the debate has migrated onto very specific narrow issues like the state and local tax deduction, which affects just a handful of lawmakers in the House who happen to have red districts in a blue state. Mike Johnson was asked when he was leaving the White House about SALT changes, and he says he hopes the Senate changes it in a very small way. How do we translate he'll speak very small way into an actual number? Would reducing that amount by $10,000, for example, be considered very small?
They're going to risk it.
Okay.
The Senate's going to test it. This is a massive. So when you see the scoring, there are two pieces of the debate right now. Is that there is those on the lower end of the scale are going to see their net benefits from government be reduced. And at the top end of the scale, you're going to see a greater tax cut. That is driven around SALT and a debate about Medicaid. If you are working poor and you're not on Medicaid, this is a tax cut for you. If you're receiving Medicaid and you're gaming the system, yes, that's a huge loss. So work requirements are always going to skew as this you're cutting people. What you're saying is if you're able-bodied, you should not be on governmental services. So that becomes a point of debate. The second piece of that is the SALT deduction. A SALT deduction has the greatest impact on the higher end of the distribution for high-income individuals in blue states. The reason why we have the SALT deduction at $10,000, capped at $10,000 for the first time in American history, is because in 2017, Republicans had sufficient votes to go beyond blue state Republicans in the House. This time around, that is not the case. The Republican majority in the House is driven out of Republicans from New Jersey and New York. Without them, Hakeem Jeffries is Speaker of the House, not Mike Johnson. So they do have a serious role here. The Senate cares not one whit
And
about
they've let us know
this
it.
debate.
Yes, they have.
So the tension here is going to be a lot of performative acts around what is actually going to happen. I think we can fast forward here. This is going to be basically the House trying to be the sheepdog to steer the Senate to a package that the House will consume and pass and put to the president's desk. That is actually what we're hearing here between congressional leaders.
The House as sheepdog, not the Senate jamming the House.
Well, this is assuming the jam, and trying to
assume the jam,
trying to
limit the jam,
trying to massage the product,
massage the jam,
such that you can consume the jam.
Okay,
wow, this has
good.
gotten out of hand.
I like this a lot. No, all right, but
this is much more a Friday afternoon conversation.
Let's
I'm
make
sorry,
it
I'm
Friday.
taking it that way.
Bring us inside the minds of the SALT caucus. You're a member from New York. You're a tough guy. Hell no is what we're hearing. Not $1 less than $40,000. You dealt with this all the time, though. How much of this is bluster? When you're alone in a room, are we really voting for the tax hike if you bring this down to $30,000? Maybe you're going to tell me yes, because you can't primary them with a MAGA candidate. Okay,
so the difficulty here is if you're a Republican and you're in the New York media market, you're one of the most sound, active politicians you can possibly be. You've been put through a meat grinder. You know what it's like to have the media blaring at you and to be like a unicorn in this space. So they're professional in how they're taking this. They're going to fight for as high a deduction as they possibly can because it benefits their constituents. That's really, and therefore benefits their politics and re-electability.
Sure.
And they are really proficient in how they act. They're sticking together, and they know how to negotiate. So is it going to be $30,000, or is it going to be some number between 30 and 40? We're going to see, but there's going to be a lot of performance between now and then, and a lot of heartache before the vote as well.
Well, and between now and then, there's other legislative efforts underway on the Hill and in the House specifically, where we saw a markup this week of the Clarity Act. This is the long-awaited market structure legislation, an iteration, shall we say, of the FIT 21 Act that passed while you were still in the chamber, trying to delineate authority between the SEC and CFTC here. Some concerns are being raised about this, though, and I wonder how you view the prospects, specifically the prospects of ultimately reconciling it with whatever the Senate would like to do on market structure.
So what French Hill constructed with this market structure bill in the House took what we did last Congress, built on it, refined it. I think it's a better product and much more balanced product than it was last Congress, and durable. I mean, this is a set of policy that can make its way unchanged, signed in law. What we saw with the markup yesterday is that the actions of the Trump family engaged in crypto has made it very difficult for pro-crypto Democratic members to participate in the policymaking here. So you saw complete performative acts around the president's family and their actions in crypto. That was what the whole markup was about. Not about the substance of the policy or some concern about the substance of the policy, but it was all about the politics of the Democratic politicians vis-a-vis the president and the president's family. That tells me it's not actually the legislation that's the problem. It's going to be giving Democratic members enough cover that they can actually participate and cast the votes they want to participate. And there are a lot of Democratic members of the House and the Senate that want to do that. Still, we saw 69 Democratic votes in the Senate, very high vote total for the stablecoin bill. I think the pairing of those two is inevitable post-tax bill. And I think those two getting pushed together as a single vote to go to a single bill to the president's desk is the most reasonable outcome of this summer.
So post-tax bill meaning it happens this fall?
No, I
realistically,
think,
or really before the August recess?
I think what we're going to see is a major push to take the Senate tax bill through the House before 4th of July, and then July becomes crypto month, and the president have a bill at the end of the month.
Wow, we just named July. It's crypto month. Fantastic. Patrick McHenry, thank you so much. I didn't get a chance to ask you what would happen at the congressional dinner tonight at the White House. We'll do that next time you're with us. The great Patrick McHenry, Bloomberg Politics contributor. See you on the late edition of Balance of Power. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.